there's 95-ish of you, so I want to go ahead and get started. So this is how this is going to work. I'm going to walk through the test as it is now. I'm going to talk about what changes I would expect to see. Then I'm going to answer questions that you guys have from the quiz. I don't know that I'll answer them directly, but I'll answer them enough that I clarify some things, and then I will answer all content questions. Also, as I go through the test, I might ask questions that if I don't answer, I expect people in the class to answer, but if you don't answer, I'm not going to necessarily answer it. So, kind of telling you test questions. Any questions about any of that before we begin? All right, cool. Let's go ahead and start. So Unit 1 exam. Going ahead and looking at this. There are 2 questions that come from the first couple pages that talk about the history and origins of geography. So like, where did it come from? What cultures contributed to the early formation of geography? You're definitely going to want to make sure that you know reference of those. Who came up with the term geography? All right? Physical and human geography. How are they related to each other? How are they connected? Remember, we are not an environmental science class, but we are concerned with how the environment impacts us. We are concerned with environmental determinism. So those are going to be some big elements for us to think about. All right, scale. Who can tell me what scale is?
Like the relationship between the part of a map that's being studied and the whole thing of it.
Okay, and why does it matter? Like contextually, why does scale matter? Give me like a real world instance where scale could be impactful.
The governor of a small county wouldn't care about a large scale map in the U.S. Instead, they would want to look at a scale map of their county.
Good, excellent. All right, different maps serve different functions and are useful in different ways. We need to be able to know and identify those different uses and ways, okay? There will be some examples of scale, so like whether it's a graphic scale, a written scale, a ratio, or a fraction scale, you'll just need to be able to identify those. Projection comes up, as well as those old historic questions about where geography comes from. All right, here are some terms that you have to know. Mathematical location, situation, site. Mathematical location, situation, site. You also, going along in the boat of mathematical location, you have to understand how longitude and latitude work. All right? There's a difference between longitude and latitude, but remember there are also some key lines and numbers that you need to know to understand. And if you know those numbers, you can find anything on Earth. So the equator is 0 degrees latitude. I think of latitude because it's like a ladder. You climb it up like a ladder. All right, ladder, that's what I think of. Longitude, you've got the prime meridian and the international date line. And you can use those 3 lines to reference anything on Earth. Kevin?
Do I need to know the international date line?
Yes, that's the other one. You'll definitely need to know the international date line too. Okay. All of that is used to determine where things are at. Go ahead, you can grab a spot. We just got started. And to find things. You might have to get a spot on the floor. We're full. Don't go up on the ladder. Okay. History of maps, map projection and distortion. Why do we do it? Question about scale. I'll give this away. There's a question about metric scale. So metric distance scale. So I'm going to ask you to go back to some like grade school map. How does the metric system work? Powers of 10. Distance of powers of 10. I would take a look at that. Scale, distortion, absolute location, longitude and latitude. All right, who can tell me what environmental determinism is? One I've not heard of. Tyler?
Your environment determines like the culture.
The environment determines your culture and how you live. You live in a desert, you dig a well. You live in a place that grows rice, you eat rice. All right? That is the idea of environmental determinism. Questions about diffusion. All right? Questions about specific examples. So I've got my different types of diffusion. All right? What is stimulus diffusion?
So when the actual object doesn't spread, but a concept or an idea does.
Good. So we were talking about this earlier. McDonald's adopting its menu in different places is stimulus diffusion because the underlying concept of fast food restaurants diffuses, but the food is slightly different as we go through it. All right, excellent. Relocation diffusion.
Like ideas are spread by the relocation of like people and like movement of people.
Physical movement of people. Good. Hierarchical diffusion.
The spread of an idea from person to nose, from authority or power to other persons or places.
Okay, and then contagious. What?
Something that spreads and overstays
Rapidly, and the big difference is it's not traced to a node. Now, contagious and hierarchical are both what we call additive expansion or additive diffusion. The number grows, but we can't necessarily trace it to a single point if it's contagious. Hierarchical, we can trace it. Constantine made the Holy Roman Empire Catholic, which he converted to Catholicism. Okay, I've said this before, but I'll say it again. You need to know how the township and range system works. You also have to be able to break down what is concentration versus density. And if you paid attention at all when we did that experiment in class, it's a pretty simple thing. Definition of distribution. Who can explain to me what a transnational corporation is? I haven't heard. Yeah.
A transnational corporation is where the corporation is equally divided up into different countries and even different continents. So they'll have like military connections here, they'll have like financing in different countries.
Yes, excellent. They sell multiple places and then they take advantage of comparative advantage of different places that do different things well. China has cheap labor and low environmental regulations, making it an excellent place to put a factory. But Silicon Valley has a lot of financing and a lot of skilled engineers, making it a great place for design. All right. Okay, scale. There's going to be specific examples of all the regions. So, what would be an example of a vernacular region? The Rust Belt. Okay, why? It's a perceived region, but it's not an actual area. There's not a definitive map that would go with it. Good. All right. Here's my little slight cheat sheet for you guys on those kinds of things. Look at it and say, like a nodal region has to have a what? It has to have a node. A formal region has to have what? Boundaries. All right. If they don't have those, they don't apply. Site situation, GPS. Spatial analysis, understanding what spatial analysis is, understanding the coastal landscape. What is possibilism? Can someone define possibilism for me? Have not heard from. Yeah, Alex.
Like, if you can or cannot do it, like, based on what's around you.
Maybe. It's a different way of thinking about it. Brooklyn?
The idea that we can change our environment.
The idea that we can change our environment, that we're not just constrained to our environment, but that we can supersede environmental constraints. All right, site. Ooh, there's a question about Chicago. Diffusion. All right, I talked about barriers to diffusion, and I broke it into 3 categories. What were my 3 categories of barriers of diffusion? What was one of them? No. Distance, I mean, that's not wrong. So I guess we would say distance is the fourth barrier. That distance, because that's not wrong. And that's what Tobert's law, like, that does work. But the three that I talked about directly in class, yes? Development. How is development a barrier of diffusion?
Because certain places will develop quicker than others.
Yes, but what does it mean to not be developed? How does not being developed impact your ability to receive diffusion?
You don't have access to as many products.
Good. All right. What's another barrier?
Culture.
Culture. Why could culture be a barrier to diffusion?
Some cultures might not
Some cultures might not
like it.
like it. All right. And the last one? Government. And why might government be a barrier to diffusion? They want to control their people. It's probably not in the benefit of Kim Jong-un to have his people know about, I don't know. What?
Hold on, never mind.
The SpaceX flight last night. Did you watch that? It's awesome. Okay. Continuing to go through these. Talk about GIS and GPS. Regions. Spatial distribution. Different types of maps. So like what's a choropleth, what's dot density, what's a topographic map. All right, what's the idea, their contrary ideas, distance decay versus space-time compression? One I've heard of. Kevin, I don't think I've heard of. It's what?
Like if something happens in like one physical war, like a country like a bunch of miles away won't hear about it as much as like pretty close.
Right, the further away you get from something, the less likely you're to have that contact. But space-time compression fights back against that idea a bit. How does space-time compression, hello, how does space-time compression work? Yeah.
It works because the ideas of people or objects are able to travel through space and limited amounts of time.
Okay, so give me a real-world example of space-time compression making the world smaller.
Flights take you from the U.S. all the way to Asia in a matter of hours.
Sure, flights could take you from the U.S. to Asia. But here's an important point, and I want to make sure that we're all clear on this. They couldn't take you from small-town Kansas to small-town Asia. They take you from New York to Beijing. And that's a powerful lesson in space-time compression. Because arguably what we have seen is we have seen more connection between globalization and global cities, but rural areas still lag, even in the United States. And what it's created is this interesting dynamic that, like, distance decay says that London and New York should be less like each other than New York City and Governor, New York, which is a small town in northern upstate New York. But space-time compression says, well, actually, New York and London might even be closer to each other, and the development might not be equally spread. All right, functional region, and then site and situation. Okay, that's the test as it is right now. Here's what I would anticipate seeing me add onto the test. I would probably expect some more questions about diffusion or regions. I think we're maybe a little bit light on that. If not that, spatial analysis. So that's like the three things that as I edit and or change things, that's what I would add to the test. Now I would like to answer questions. Diffusion, regions, spatial analysis. It's analyzing the relationship of pattern, distribution, concentration, and connections of an area to understand something. And that something is, there's a million different things. Like, you could provide a spatial area analysis of your block, or of the entire Overland Park area, or of the entire state of Kansas. But it is looking at the connections and the linkages and like trying to extrapolate something. But it's thinking spatially. It's thinking about why you go to the grocery store you do versus the one over here, or like all those different things. That is, the spatial thinking is about the relationships between the different places across the world and why they matter. Yes?
Can you repeat that definition for spatial analysis?
Oh man, could I do it verbatim? I don't know if I can do that or not. It's the examination of distribution, concentration, pattern, and connections of a place. And those four terms I think really are it. And those are four big terms from chapter 1. Distribution, concentration, pattern, space. Looking at a place or a community. And here, I'll perform a brief spatial area analysis of Overland Park. Why is the Blue Valley School District such a high-performing school district? Well, I look at the median home prices, and I see that, it's higher than a lot of the rest of the state. Now, higher home prices generally indicates higher level of education of the people living there. So if you have culture and family that values education, wouldn't it stand to reason that you would have schools that then are reflective of said values, all right? But then I could go even further than that with my spatial area analysis. I could look at homes owned versus homes rented. I could look at early childhood education centers. I could look at libraries. I could look at, like, what are those private math businesses now? They're like, what are they called?
Kumon.
There's lots of them where it's like, you go and you learn math, and it's like, there's not a lot of those in East Kansas City. There's a lot of them down here. Yes? Chloroplast, and I get fuzzy on these sometimes, that's the color map, I believe, where it's like you use different colors. So like the COVID map on New York Times is a chloroplast, where the darker the color is, the more intense the COVID rates of infection are. That would be a chloroplast. When? Probably cultural. Yeah. Here's a good question. How's the coastal landscape both cultural landscape and also not? It could be both. Coastal landscape would not be coastal landscape in a national park where it's just the natural landscape. Coastal landscape in Malibu, where you have some of the most expensive real estate on earth and you have all these mansions, would be the cultural landscape. Because it is a place where humans have built upon the environment. Government, culture, distance, and Rashab's right, we should add distance on there because that is true. And government, culture, distance, and tech development. I think there's more questions about site and situation than anything. Well, no, site and situation is 1.1, 1.2. 1.4 is the environmental. There is least in 1.4. 1, 1, 1, 2, and 1, 3 are probably equally weighted. 79. I don't know. I haven't decided yet. There we go. Yeah, it was a method for gridding and dividing land in the United States. It's in the book. There is a definition. There's a definition in the book. If you find it, will help you answer the question. And it was a way of dividing the land of what was viewed as an empty America by, the settlers, which it wasn't, but like it was a way of how to organize the new world. Yes.
Can you repeat the prices?
Dot density, chloroplast, cartogram, chloroplast, C-L-E-T-H, cartogram. Oh, and topographic. Can I elaborate on what? Hearth, yeah, for sure. Hearth is the origin of something, all right? Hearth is the node of where something began. So the hearth of the Islamic faith is Mecca. Like, there is a place where you could say it began. And where the hearth is generally where the said thing will be strongest at. And then the further away, it's almost like a functional region. It doesn't have to be. Like the hearth of pizza is Naples, but then it diffused elsewhere, and then we get all the variations. Pizza is a good example of stimulus diffusion. Because you got New York, Chicago, Detroit style, St. Louis style, Naples. You got all these different variations, all right? You don't have to holler from back there. Desertification is just very simply the loss of topsoil to make the land unfarmable and unlivable. And it's a form of erosion. Generally caused by man. Generally caused by man. Yes?
So I don't finish the test tomorrow. Is it just like target what we got?
Why would you finish the test tomorrow?
Like 79 questions.
Not that.
There's a time limit. So whatever's not done is not done. That's how it works on the AP test.
Oh.
Class. We rise to the occasion. We rise like the phoenix out of the ashes of our quiz. Yes. All multiple choice. I can't hear. It's a thematic map that tells the story by the sorting size.